restless wind swept across the Panhandle, rustling the dry grasses and stirring the dust along the trail as two of Charles Goodnight's cowboys rode slowly, scanning the terrain for signs of movement. The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the plains. The air was thick with the scent of mesquite, and the distant bleating of sheep carried faintly on the wind. It was supposed to be a routine patrol, but nothing in the Texas Panhandle was ever routine. Goodnight had made a deal with Casimero Romero, the leader of the Pastores, Mexican shepherds who tended flocks of sheep in the Canadian River Valley. They had agreed to divide the land. The Pastores would graze their sheep along the fertile stretches of the Canadian River, while Goodnight's cattle would roam to the south, near the Red River and Paladura Canyon. It was an uneasy truce, meant to keep blood from being spilled. But lately, rumors of violence had been swirling like the dust on the plains. Tensions were building, and Goodnight had sent his men to keep an eye on things. The cowboys came upon the camp suddenly, cresting a low ridge that opened into a small clearing. There they found it, desolate and eerily quiet. Sheep milled about aimlessly, without a shepherd to guide them. The camp itself was in shambles. Pots and supplies were scattered, the fire long dead. One of the cowboys, a grizzled old-timer named Slim, swung down from his horse and moved toward the center of the camp. His boots crunched in the dirt as he crouched to inspect the remains of the fire. "That's odd," Slim muttered, rubbing his thumb along a piece of charred wood. "Looks like it was put out in a hurry." Tommy, the other cowboy, younger and more brash, stayed in the saddle, his eyes scanning the edges of the camp. "Where's the shepherd?" he asked, a hint of unease creeping into his voice. Slim didn't answer, his eyes now fixed on a form partially obscured by a pile of old blankets near the edge of the clearing. "Over here," he said. Tommy dismounted, tying his horse to a nearby scrub bush. Together, they approached the pile. Slim gently nudged the blankets aside with the toe of his boot. The body of a man lay underneath, his face pale and lifeless, eyes staring blankly into the sky. Blood stained the dirt around him, now dried and dark. The shepherd had been shot, his hand still clutching a simple wooden staff. "Damn," the young cowboy whispered, taking a step back. "He never had a chance." Slim shook his head, his expression grim. "Nope. Whoever did this wasn't interested in a fight. They wanted to send a message." A faint whimper broke the silence, and both men turned toward the edge of the camp. There, struggling to stand on three legs, was a sheepdog. Its fur was matted with blood, and one eye was swollen shut. Yet it still stood, its body quivering, trying to herd the sheep that wandered near the edge of the clearing. The young cowboy felt a lump rise in his throat. "Poor thing's still doing his job," he muttered to himself. Slim reached down and picked up the dog, cradling it in his arms. "It's got more guts than most men I've known," he said quietly. He glanced around the camp one last time, taking in the mess of supplies, the lifeless body, and the abandoned sheep. "You think it was the Mexicans?" Tommy said. "More than likely," Slim replied, looking toward the horizon and then back at the shepherd, a white man. "That's got to be one of the Californians running sheep out here, Kasner's outfit," Slim remarked. Tommy nodded and climbed back into the saddle. Slim lifted the injured dog and placed it across his lap. "We need to get back to headquarters and let the boss know what we found," he said. "This ain't good." With a final glance at the camp, the cowboys turned their horses and rode off, leaving the clearing to the wandering sheep and the echoes of violence that would soon reverberate down the Canadian River Valley. Hey y'all, I'm Jody Slaughter, and welcome to West Texas, where the sky stretches on forever and the stories are as vast and rugged as the landscape itself. On this episode, we're not featuring a person, but a whole town, Tascosa. You won't find it on a map, not anymore, but in its short run as the unofficial capital of the Panhandle, it burned as brightly as anywhere and hosted outlaws and lawmen that would become legends of the West, like Billy the Kid and Pat Garrett, Charlie Seringo, and Bat Masterson. So grab a seat, kick off your boots, and settle in, because this is West Texas. The Texas Panhandle in the late 1800s was a wild, rugged land of endless plains stretching as far as the eye could see, marked by deep canyons and the winding Canadian River. Dust storms swept across the open range, and scorching summers gave way to brutal winters. In this unforgiving terrain, you could hear the steady rhythm of hoofbeats as cattle herds roamed. The calls of cowboys echoed in the dry air, mingled with the sharp cry of a buzzard circling overhead. The wind swept across this land, kicking up clouds of dust that coated everything in a fine, gritty layer. It was here, amidst this wild landscape, that Tascosa emerged as a rough and tumble frontier town where cattlemen, traders, and outlaws crossed paths. It only existed for a brief time, but when it did, it shone as brightly as any town in the Old West before disappearing almost completely. The site of Tascosa was no accident. As a low, flat, and easy crossing point on the Canadian River, it had been used by animals, then the prehistoric Panhandle Indian culture. Later, nomadic tribes used the spot. It became a place where Native Americans would meet to trade with the Comancheros. If there's a border between the North and South Plains, it is the Canadian River. More than just a geographical feature, it was the lifeblood of the plains, shaping the routes of trade and travel across the West Texas frontier. In the mid-1800s, the Comancheros served as intermediaries between the Comanche and the white men. The Comancheros were a group of frontier traders, mostly of Hispanic descent, who established a complex trade network with the Comanche. They traded goods like weapons, ammunition, and whiskey for horses, cattle, and other plundered items, operating in a shadow economy on the fringes of legality. The ciboleros, on the other hand, were buffalo hunters, traversing the plains to harvest hides and meat from the dwindling bison herds. These three groups, the Comancheros, the Comanche, and the ciboleros, were about the only people you would find in the Panhandle prior to the 1870s. After the subjugation of the Comanche in the 1870s, the Comancheros and ciboleros started spreading word around the Southwest that prime grazing lands along the Canadian River were now open for business. Author John L. McCarty would write in his seminal book, Maverick Town, The Story of Old Tascosa, quote, "The plains offered a treasure land of grass, which had nothing on it of consequence now that the buffaloes were gone," end quote. Most of the early settlers came not from the east, but from the west, with Hispanic sheep herders moving their flocks down the valley from New Mexico. The smarter shepherds figured out that Texas assessed taxes on January 1st, while New Mexico assessed on March 1st. As a result, you would be hard-pressed to find a single sheep in Texas on January 1st, but by March, there were basically none left in New Mexico. The first permanent settlement came in the 1870s when Justo Ventura Borrego led several families of pastores, sheep herders, down from Taos, New Mexico. They built the Plaza Borrega, a line of rock and adobe houses, along with corrals for their sheep, goats, and horses. Soon more families arrived, and other plazas sprung up along the river. By the mid-1870s, these small-time sheep outfits had staked their claims on sections of prime grassland adjoining their plazas. But soon, larger commercial herds were being moved in seasonally from New Mexico as well. In 1876, former Comanchero Casimero Romero drove 4,500 sheep into the state and built a plaza on Atascosa Creek near the Canadian River. Meanwhile, cattlemen like Charles Goodnight were also moving herds into the area. Disputes broke out over water and grass, and eventually something had to give. Romero, with one of the largest flocks, became somewhat of a leader of the pastores. He negotiated a handshake agreement with Goodnight where the pastores could graze their sheep along the Canadian River Valley, while Goodnight would keep his cattle further south in the Paladura Canyon area along the Red River. But not everyone shared Goodnight's temperament. By the mid-1870s, other cattlemen began pushing into the area and competing with the pastores for prime grazing land along the river. These were hard men on both sides, and law and order simply didn't exist in the Panhandle at this time. Justice wasn't something that was given, it was taken. In the mid-1870s, while tending to his flock, one of the pastores, Don Vicente Larcubleta, sorry if I'm butchering that, was ambushed and killed. Accounts differ on the actual killers, but to the pastores, there could have been only one culprit: white cattlemen. Don Vicente's son, Sostenes, erupted into a rage with the news, vowing to kill any white man he saw, and he meant it. Later that year, 2 of Charles Goodnight's men were scouting near Paladura Canyon when they came across a sheep camp. They found the herd of sheep unattended, a looted camp, and an injured dog still painfully herding the sheep alone. The dog had a gunshot wound to the eye. They also found the body of a dead shepherd. Goodnight received word and rode in from his home in Pueblo, Colorado. He learned that a group of Mexican pastores had been feuding with the Casimero family, a group of California shepherds who had recently brought their flock into the Panhandle. 2 Casimero brothers arrived at Goodnight's ranch to claim their flock and vowed to clear the Canadian River Valley of any Mexican pastores they could find. Goodnight told them he would not allow them to terrorize the Panhandle, pointing to his well-armed cowboys and promising to uphold law and order. Nevertheless, the Casimero brothers rode to Plaza Borrega, where they indiscriminately murdered a number of Mexican pastores and their families. Messengers rode far and wide, alerting the pastores that the Californians were on a rampage in the Canadian River Valley. Many pastores gathered their belongings, families, and flocks and fled back to New Mexico. Screw this. Meanwhile, at a trading post, the Casimero brothers were told that a notorious horse thief, Goodnight, had been involved in the murder of their kin. Before they could locate him, Goodnight learned that they were on his tail and turned himself in at Fort Elliott, near modern-day Wheeler. The Casimeros arrived, demanding his release, but the army refused. Since this was a state matter, the fort sent for the sheriff to retrieve the prisoner. But the sheriff wanted nothing to do with this mess and sent a deputy instead. The deputy arrived, and the army provided 5 guards to ensure the safe delivery of the prisoner to the courthouse. The transport party left, camping the first night, and at midnight, the Casimero brothers, along with 5 hired buffalo hunters armed with their .50 caliber Sharps rifles, charged into the camp, demanding that they turn over Goodnight. They claimed they just needed to talk to him alone. The next morning, the soldiers and the deputy found Goodnight hanged from a cottonwood tree. The Casimero brothers, now wanted as well, took their sheep and fled Texas as quickly as the pastores had. So in less than a decade, the Panhandle had gone from being the capital of Comancheria, teeming with bison, to being overtaken by sheep herders after the buffalo were exterminated and the Comanche were moved to Fort Sill. Now the sheep were mostly gone too, but the Canadian River still flowed and the grass still grew as far as the eye could see. The cattleman's time had arrived. In the years following the Civil War, the cattle boom transformed the American West. As railroads pushed further into the plains, cattle drives became big business. The open range, with its vast, unfenced grasslands, attracted cattlemen seeking fortune. Tascosa, situated near the Canadian River's prime grazing lands, was poised to become a key player in this new economy. Just as the bison, the nomadic Indian bands who followed them, traders, travelers, and conquistadors had for countless years before, the cattlemen pushing herds north quickly found the shallow, fordable, and easiest place to cross the Canadian River. It was named after the plaza nearby at Tascosa. The only difference was that now it was overlooked by the adobe plazas of the pastores. Here, cowboys rested under the same trees that had offered shade to legends like Quanah Parker, the last chief of the Comanche, and Kit Carson, the famous frontiersman and scout. Charles Goodnight, who had decided to move his herds from Colorado into the Panhandle in 1875, smartly paused in New Mexico, outside of the Comanche's range, after hearing about the slaughter of a group of buffalo hunters at the Second Battle of Adobe Walls the previous year. In May of 1875, the Comanche surrendered, and Goodnight was free to move in, staking claim to Paladura Canyon. Major George Littlefield arrived with his herds in the fall of 1877, establishing the first branded cattle ranch near the crossing, the LIT Ranch. But as this was the time of the open range, Littlefield didn't claim ownership of any land. He didn't put up any fences. He simply used whatever land he needed. As word of the excellent open range conditions spread, other similar squatter ranges sprung up. The LX Ranch in 1877, By 1879, two more large branded outfits had established themselves in the Canadian River Valley, the LE and LS ranches. Other ranches would soon pop up, including the LX and the Frying Pan. More and more cowboys began drifting into the Panhandle from other parts of the state and country looking for work. And along with them came outlaw cattle rustlers, including one of the most famous in the world. Oftentimes, cowboys and rustlers were one and the same. A cowboy losing his job on one ranch would turn to the outlaw life until he found another legitimate job with another ranching outfit. With no real law to speak of, Tascosa's residents lived with the constant tension of knowing that a drunken brawl or a misunderstanding could erupt into a deadly gunfight at any moment. It was a town where disputes were often settled at the end of a revolver. As Tascosa grew, it began to evolve into an actual community and trading hub. The state sent in surveyors and began selling land, encouraging more settlers, tradesmen, and businessmen to arrive. Charlie Stout arrived and found work as a cowpuncher for the LX Ranch. The cowboy would later become a legendary detective, Pinkerton agent, and author. In Seringo's books, he recounts that during the summer of 1877, there were about a half dozen Mexican families, a store, and at least 8 nearby ranches at Tascosa. The 2-room adobe general store sold whiskey, medications, ammunition, dry goods, and sundries. Later in 1877, a second store opened, and in 1880, a blacksmith set up shop. That same year, the Exchange Hotel opened. In 1881, the first saloon, the Equity Bar, opened next door. The business owners purchased prime locations for retail, whether they needed them or not, and conspired to keep competition out. A third storekeeper tried to open up, but found himself unable to secure any land in the business district, so he set up a few hundred yards downriver in an area that would become known as Hogtown. By then, Tascosa had transformed into a bustling, albeit rough, frontier town. It wasn't much to look at, just a cluster of adobe buildings, the Exchange Hotel, a couple of saloons, and dusty streets lined with hitching posts for the endless stream of horses. The Equity Bar was always bustling, while the blacksmith's shop clanged with the sounds of hammers on iron. Despite its rough edges, Tascosa was becoming the beating heart of the Panhandle, attracting settlers, cowboys, and outlaws alike. It wasn't by design. It was just the easy crossing, the interstate highway for cattle heading north or south. Eventually, the townsfolk petitioned Washington, D.C. for a post office at Tascosa, but it was denied because there was already a city and county in Texas with that same name. The paperwork was resubmitted, dropping the A, and Tascosa was officially born, with the post office opening on June 24th, 1878. Waves of settlers, now including women and children, continued to arrive in covered wagons. In 1880, Oldham County was formed, with Upper Tascosa chosen as the county seat in a narrow vote over Hogtown. The Tascosa townsfolk celebrated at the hotel with cowboys firing their Colt 45s in the air, resulting in one accidental death. The rivalry between Upper Tascosa and Hogtown, more formally known as Lower Tascosa, heated up, as Hogtown now boasted a store, hotel, and a saloon of its own. Hey, West Texas, I want to tell you quickly about Code Ninjas, where your kids can grow their STEM skills and build confidence and critical thinking abilities, all while making friends and having fun. With year-round programs for kids 5 and up, Code Ninjas will teach your kids how to build their own video games, all in a fun and safe environment. With West Texas locations in Lubbock, Midland, and El Paso, plus all over the country, visit codeninjas.com today and claim your free trial class where your kid will build their first video game. Plus, mention you heard about it on the West Texas podcast to get their first month for just $50. That offer is good at the Lubbock location only. Code Ninjas, creating a world where kids write the code. Tascosa now had a post office, but getting in and out, especially in winter, was still hazardous. There was a particularly treacherous 35-mile stretch between Bonita Creek and Dixon Creek, a featureless prairie where a rider could easily get lost at night in a storm or when snow covered the ground. Just to pause here, it may be helpful if you want to go to our website, wtxpodcast.com, and find the article about this episode. We've got some maps up there that might help get you oriented to where all these things are at. But Marion Armstrong, the cowboy, was originally hired to carry the mail between Tascosa and Mobeetie over in Wheeler County. On one such trip, arriving late after his wagon had broken through ice on the Canadian River, Armstrong got chewed out by the postmaster for his tardiness. He warned the postmaster that if they didn't stake out the road, someone was going to die. His request was refused, so he quit on the spot. Another cowboy, John Cannington, was hired to replace him. On just his second trip, Cannington got lost in a snowstorm for 3 days. When he finally arrived in Mobeetie, his feet were black from frostbite and both had to be amputated. His replacement, Tom Wilson, wouldn't be so lucky. Just 2 weeks after his appointment, traveling with 2 passengers in an uncovered wagon, Wilson and his group set off into the biggest snowstorm of the season. As S.C. Gwynn wrote in the classic book, Empire of the Summer Moon, quote, "People from the east or west coast of America may think they have seen a blizzard. Likely they have not. It is almost exclusively a phenomenon of the plains, and it got its name on the plains. It entailed wind-driven snow so dense and temperatures so cold that anyone lost in them on the shelterless plains was as good as dead." End quote. The frigid wind howled across the barren prairie, turning the Canadian River surface to a sheet of ice. Snow blanketed the land, muffling the sounds of life and leaving the world in an eerie, white silence. Halfway through the barren stretch, their mules got stuck, and the wagon tongue broke. With their tracks now covered and no clear path to return, the group decided to unhitch the mules and lead them on foot in their original direction, using the wind as their guide. But as the wind changed direction, as it tends to do in the Panhandle, they trudged right past Dixon Creek, missing it to the southwest. They wandered for 3 days, with nothing but a buffalo hide robe to protect them from the elements. One of the passengers' feet became so frozen that he could no longer walk, and they had to put him on a mule. On the third night, the mules ran away. The next morning, Wilson and the other passenger covered the injured man in the robe, promising to return for him, and set off on foot. After walking for a few miles, they found a ranch road and followed it. Along the road, the second passenger collapsed, unable to go any further. Wilson left him and soldiered on alone until he was spotted by an LX ranch hand gathering firewood. The ranch hand took Wilson to headquarters, where he relayed the location of the man left on the road before collapsing himself. The ranch hand set out to find him, but couldn't locate the man before nightfall. He was eventually found dead 2 days later. Once the weather cleared, the ranch brought Wilson to the Army hospital at Fort Elliott for treatment, but he died there a few days later. They would never locate the first passenger, left wrapped in the buffalo robe, though years later a cowboy found a skeleton near the location where he was said to have been left. It would have cost just $10 to stake the 35-mile stretch of road. Instead, 3 lives were lost. The violence and lawlessness that defined Tascosa in the 1870s wasn't unique to the area. Across the border in New Mexico, similar conflicts were unfolding in what would become known as the Lincoln County War, a violent struggle for economic power. Rival factions, including cattle barons, merchants, and corrupt lawmen, fought for dominance over the lucrative beef contracts and trade routes in the region. Billy the Kid, a young and infamous outlaw, became embroiled in the conflict after the murder of his employer and friend, John Tunstall. Initially seeking justice, Billy joined a group called the Regulators, who took the law into their own hands. The war quickly devolved into a cycle of revenge killings, with Billy the Kid claiming at least 4 lives himself and becoming a wanted man. Despite attempts at a truce, the bloodshed continued. And newspaper articles around the country made Billy a symbol of the lawlessness that gripped the West. But even famous outlaws need to eat. And finding prospects for pay drying up in New Mexico and prospects for arrest or worse increasing by the day, Billy the Kid gathered his men, they stole 125 horses, and headed to Texas. By the late 1870s, Tascosa was a town simmering with unease. Outlaws and rustlers had become a growing threat to the cattlemen's interests. Into this powder keg rode Billy the Kid. Accompanying him were a gang of like-minded outlaws, including the hardened sharpshooter Dave Rudabaugh, the loyal Charlie Beaudry, and Tom O'Folliard, barely out of his teenage years. Together they made up a dangerous band of rustlers ready to take on the open range. The arrival of a gang of outlaws with their reputation surely concerned the cattlemen, and a group of the largest outfits called the Kid in to meet with him. Billy came happily and answered all their questions with a smile. He told the ranchers that he had heard they were short of horses and that he had come to supply them. That was it. He promised that he and his men just wanted to be left alone and they wouldn't cause any trouble. Billy and his gang soon became fixtures in Tascosa, drinking, gambling, racing horses, target shooting, and of course, horse trading. There was even a legendary target shooting contest between Billy, Temple Houston, Sam Houston's son, and Bat Masterson. Houston won. By most accounts, Billy and his gang kept their word and were well behaved during their time in Tascosa. No one even witnessed Billy taking a drink while in the Panhandle. The worst incident was a misunderstanding at one of the Mexican dances, or bailes, at a Casimero Romero Plaza house. The bailes thrown by the pastores were important social and cultural gatherings that went beyond mere entertainment. These dances were typically held in plazas or homes of prominent figures in the community, such as Casimero Romero, and played a key role in maintaining Hispanic traditions in the frontier environment. Music, often played on guitars, fiddles, and accordions, set the backdrop for traditional dances like the ranchera and fandango, which were central to the festivities. These bailes brought together men, women, and families from the surrounding areas, white and Hispanic, and served as vital spaces for courtship, celebration, and community bonding. People dressed in their finest clothes, and although the atmosphere was joyful, the community elders enforced certain rules of decorum, like the unwritten rule banning firearms from these events. Ultimately, the bailes served not only as entertainment, but also as a way to maintain cultural traditions and pass them on to younger generations in the tight-knit Hispanic communities. Now, at one of these bailes held at Casimero Romero's Plaza, Billy tripped while entering the building and fell down onto the middle of the dance floor. His men, thinking he was in a fight, all produced hidden 6 guns and surrounded him, pointing their shooters at the other attendees. There was no actual threat, but they had broken the rule against carrying firearms. And after this incident, Billy's men were banned from the bailes. By 1878, most of the horses had been traded off and the gang began to drift. Some settled in Tascosa while others rambled along to other places. Billy had made some money, a few friends, and had also learned a lot about the local ranches and their operations. As attrition dwindled his numbers, Billy recruited some locals to fill the open positions. Their time being good, cordial citizens finished, Billy and his gang said their goodbyes and headed out of town. But not before rustling cattle from various ranches, the LS, the LX, the LIT, and driving them to New Mexico. They sold them. They rustled more cattle in New Mexico. As their bounties mounted there, they came back to Texas and stole even more cattle, becoming more brazen with every raid. The Panhandle cattlemen were incensed, and in March 1880, Charles Goodnight, T.S. Hughes, Hank Creswell, and O.H. Nelson formed the Panhandle Cattlemen's Association. Their first order of business was to send a scouting party into New Mexico to search for Billy the Kid. They arrived at White Oaks to find hides draped outside a butcher's shop displaying the LIT brand. After speaking with locals, they learned that Billy had left 3 days earlier and that his gang was larger and more well-armed than ever, no match for the small search party. The scouts elected to head back to Texas to report their findings rather than take on the gang. The cattlemen worked out to map a campaign to retrieve their cattle and wipe out Billy the Kid and his gang once and for all. Meanwhile, a former Panhandle resident rode back into town. Pat Garrett. Garrett had been a buffalo hunter and called Tascosa home before moving to New Mexico, where he had worked as a cowpuncher for John Chisholm. He was later drafted by the cattlemen there to run for sheriff of Lincoln County, with one condition. He had to deal with Billy the Kid. Garrett, who was familiar with Billy during their time in the Panhandle, knew this would be a big and violent undertaking. He needed help, and he knew just where to find it. To quote McCarty's Maverick Town book again, Garrett needed the cold, fearless, quick-shooting frontier cowboys of the Panhandle. The Panhandle Cattlemen's Association agreed to help Garrett. Each of the large Panhandle ranches sent men. Bill Moore, foreman of the LX Ranch, chose the men he feared and wanted to get rid of, further blurring the line between outlaw and lawman. The posse set out on November 16, 1880, featuring several men who would later make their mark in some way. The most notable of these were Frank Weldon, who would later be known as the Mongolian Monster, one of the most skilled and famous rodeo cowboys of the early 1900s, and Charlie Seringo, the cowboy detective, who would write best-selling books about his time as a Panhandle cowpuncher and later as a Pinkerton detective, as well as Jim East, who was destined to become a lawman and legendary part of Tascosa's history. The posse rode into New Mexico and camped outside Las Vegas, New Mexico. Seringo was given $400 and sent into town for food and ammunition. But Las Vegas, New Mexico must have looked like Las Vegas, Nevada to old Charlie. By the time he had graced the many dance halls, saloons, gambling dens, and whorehouses, the money was gone. And Seringo had nothing to show for it but a smile on his face. Another posse member would later describe Seringo, quote, wandering down the Pecos without any grub, leaving the rest of us to tighten our belts and postpone a few meals, end quote. Now, many of the men in this posse thought they were just on a cattle recovery expedition and had not been informed of the true plan, a manhunt for one of the most notorious gunmen and outlaws in the West. When the true nature of the expedition came out, several of the men wanted no part of it and refused to continue. But Garrett was able to find 6 volunteers among the Panhandle cowboys, along with several of his own men, to ride south to Fort Sumner on the trail of Billy the Kid. They left wagons behind, took the fastest horses, and each man carried a 6-gun and a Winchester rifle. Thanks to Seringo, who opted to stay behind, they rode all day through the bitter cold without eating. Meanwhile, word had gotten out that a posse from Texas was in New Mexico on the trail of Billy the Kid. As a result, some of Billy's men started dropping out, leaving him with just 6 followers left. When Garrett's posse arrived in Fort Sumner, they learned that the gang had gone to Billy's camping spot on Lake Portales. Rather than follow them, Garrett quartered his men at a house outside of town along the road to Portales. One snowy evening, a guard noticed a small pattern of gray in the distance. It grew larger and finally resolved into a group of horsemen. The guard, who knew Billy the Kid from his Tascosa days, recognized him. He raised the alarm, and Garrett's posse moved into ambush position behind the house's short adobe fence. Billy was riding in the lead and somehow instinctively sensed something was wrong. He excused himself to go grab some tobacco and hurried to the back. Tom O'Folliard, the youngest member of the gang and the most loyal, was now in the lead as the 6 horsemen neared the house. Garrett raised up and yelled for the men to get their hands up. O'Folliard reached for his gun but didn't clear leather before 2 .45 slugs ripped through his body. He collapsed but somehow stayed on his horse. A second volley of gunfire sent the other rider spinning and disappearing into the swirling snow. The lead horse continued charging straight at the house, but its rider, O'Folliard, was nearly dead. The posse dragged him inside and laid him by the fire to die, cursing Pat Garrett until he took his last breath. For some reason, Garrett waited until morning to pursue. 12 miles away, they found a dead horse, shot through the stomach, but fresh snow obscured the trail. Luckily, they happened upon a rancher who had seen a gang of 5 men, 2 sharing a horse, headed in the direction of Stinking Springs near modern-day Taiban, New Mexico. The posse rode through the night and came upon an abandoned rock house with 3 horses tied outside the door. The 4th, Billy's racing mare, was inside the small house. Garrett, along with 4 of the Panhandle cowboys, crawled up an arroyo until they were within 30 feet of the house. Guns at the ready.
Say goodbye to the oceans. Say goodbye to the streams. Say goodbye to the stars up in the sky. Now close your eyes and say goodbye to your dreams. Say goodbye to your family. Say goodbye to your friends. Say goodbye to the road you thought rolled on forever. It stops, the party ends. Say goodbye to life. Say goodbye to liberty. Say goodbye to the endless quest for happiness. You tried your best, now say goodbye to me.
As the sun began to rise, one of Billy's gang members, Charlie Beaudry, walked outside with a feed bag for the horses. "Throw up your hands," yelled Garrett. Beaudry dropped the bag and reached for his gun. He was filled with pistol lead before he touched it. He stumbled back through the door of the house, but Billy grabbed him and threw him back outside. "Charlie, you're done for," Billy said. "See if you can get one of them before you die." Beaudry stumbled toward the hidden lawmen, fingers too weak to even cock his gun. He tripped over one of the concealed cowboys, Lee Hall, and collapsed on top of him. Hall disarmed him and flipped him over onto the snow to die. What followed was a day of taunts and blind gunshots. They were in a stalemate. At one point, the men noticed the horses, whose reins were tied up inside the house, being pulled towards the front door. It looked like Billy and his gang may be trying to pull the horses in so they could mount up and make a daring escape. As one of the horses got close to the front door, one of the posse members shot it through the heart. It fell in the doorway, trapping Billy's prize racing mare inside. There would be no brazen escape. It was so cold that December on the plains, and the remaining 4 members of Billy's gang had no fire, no food, or even any water. That night, the rancher the posse had encountered earlier rode up with some food for Garrett's men. They built a cook fire and made a stew. The smell was too much for Billy the Kid. He, along with Dave Rudabaugh, Tom Pickett, and Billy Wilson, surrendered. His only condition was that they deliver him safely and protect him from any lynch mobs. Garrett agreed. Garrett and his men delivered Billy the Kid and his gang to the jail in Las Vegas, but they still had to get him safely to Santa Fe to receive the governor's reward money. They decided the safest course of action was to transport the gang by train, but they had to wait several days for the train to arrive. Meanwhile, word had gotten around New Mexico that Billy the Kid was in custody in Las Vegas. Angry ranchers, cowboys, and vengeful family members of Billy's many victims began to pour into town. Garrett personally guarded Billy, and when the train finally arrived, Garrett and his Panhandle cowboys, guns drawn, escorted the men from the jail to the train station. The mob demanded Billy's head, but Garrett refused, assuring them that justice was coming. But the mob wouldn't have it. They surrounded the train. Garrett and his men were hopelessly outnumbered. While Billy and his gang were in a passenger car surrounded by armed guards, the engine was unprotected. The mob pulled the train engineer and firemen from the engine. That train was staying right where it was. Garrett even considered arming Billy and his gang to give them a better shot at fending off the mob. But Billy's savior wouldn't be a 6-gun. It was a mailman. J.F. Morley, an inspector with the post office, snuck into the train cabin, and just as the mob was ready to fully explode, opened the throttle. The train sped away down the tracks, out of control. Somehow, the train engineer was able to grab onto the back car as the train sped away, pull himself on board, and make his way to the engine to regain control before calamity struck. Garrett and the cowboys delivered Billy the Kid and his men to Santa Fe, collected their reward, and the posse was disbanded. To quote Maverick Town again, "For a time, Billy the Kid had met more than his match. 2 of his gang had been killed, many more had been forced to desert him, and 3 were with him in prison in Santa Fe." Garrett's reputation and that of the Panhandle Cowboys, the ranchers, and the infant Panhandle Cattlemen's Association who financed them spread far and wide. Their success had a wholesome and chilling effect on the outlaw world and definitely placed everyone on notice that the large cattle owners were not going to tolerate wholesale thievery, outlawry, and mass murder. End quote. Billy the Kid would later escape from prison in 1881, and it again fell to Garrett to hunt him down. He succeeded, putting an end to Billy the Kid once and for all with 2 gunshots on a warm July night in Fort Sumner. What Garrett couldn't have known in 1881 was that the hunt for Billy the Kid wouldn't be the last time he would be called on to aid the cattlemen of Tascosa. Another war, every bit as violent as New Mexico's Lincoln County War, was brewing back in the Texas Panhandle. You've been listening to part 1 of Tascosa, Ghosts and Outlaws on the WTX podcast. I'm Jody Slaughter. In part 2, we'll tell the rest of Tascosa's story, including how simmering tensions led to a violent shootout that caused the creation of an entire cemetery. You won't want to miss it. You can find this and all episodes on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Visit our website at WTXpodcast.com for companion articles, show notes, and photos for each episode. I actually went to Tascosa and got a lot of photos of the area as it appears today, so you'll want to make sure and check those out on the website. To get a hold of me with questions, comments, or show ideas, you can email me at lubbockist@gmail.com or on Twitter @lubbockist. This episode was written, produced, engineered, and edited by me, Jody Slaughter. This episode was scored by my AI band Gentry Ford and the Homeless Lobos. Special music in this episode, Say Goodbye, written and performed by Charlie Stout. Charlie recorded this song and the whole album in an abandoned 100-year-old church in Taiban, New Mexico, just a couple of miles from the site of Billy the Kid's capture. Special thanks to Cal Farley's Boys Ranch and the Panhandle Plains Historical Museum for providing photos and background for these episodes. Thanks for listening, and until next time, so long from West Texas.
People like to argue about where West Texas begins. Some think it's Fort Worth, somewhere near the cattle pens. Some think it's I-35 packed with Fords and Chevrolets. Others think it's where the oak trees start to fade to sand and clay. Well, I'm here to set the record straight once and for all. It's all West Texas. It's all West Texas. Whether you're surrounded by John Deere's or Lexus, congrats, you're in West Texas. Pecos Valley purists think they've got the winning hand, but they ain't gonna paint me as some Eastern Yankee man. It's all West Texas. It's all West Texas. Whether you're surrounded by John Deere's or Lexus, congrats, you're in West Texas. West Texas, Kerrville, West Texas, it's all West Texas. Austin, West Texas, Houston, West Texas, Tyler, West Texas, it's all West Texas. Seattle, West Texas, Springfield, West Texas, Chicago, West Texas.